So the other part of a bow and arrow, obviously the arrow. So I'm going to show you a little bit about this. So this is very similar to a war arrow. Now there's quite a difference between arrows that were produced by individuals to go hunting and arrows that were supplied to the army and the military for warfare. So this is much more a war arrow. The hunting arrows that we see from various documents were made out of all sorts of different things. They were fletched, so the feathers were sometimes were duck or were pheasant or peacock, whatever was to hand. The wood was again what was available at the time, and the heads were slightly different. But we're going to focus a little bit onto the war side of things and the military aspect of it. So the arrow, you might think, is just, well, you just put it all together, you get some feathers, you get a bit of wood and you slap on the tip on it. But the kind of numbers that we're talking about, so some of the battles during the medieval period, whether they're in France at places like Crécy or Poitiers, or whether they're in England at places like Towton or Bosworth, they required enormous amounts of arrows. Some of the armies that went into France had hundreds of thousands of arrows shipped across there. So you can't easily produce that kind of number just working on your own, producing the entire arrow yourself. So people specialised in their skills. You'd have one man who would be splitting down the wood and shaping it. You'd have one person who was called a fletcher. They would be attaching the feathers on the end. You'd have smiths who would be making the tips. And then you'd have someone who would basically put it all together, almost like a medieval production line. And each part of it is quite specialised in how it's selected, what the materials are and what their job is for each of them. So I'll kind of go from the top down. What we've got here, hopefully you can see, is a little black slot here and a little slot on the end. So this is the nock. This is where you put the string. So it holds the arrow in place when you're putting it on the bow, make sure that it stays stable. And this little bit of black here is horn. So that means that when you put it on there and it's taking all that pressure and you suddenly release, it doesn't shatter the end of the arrow, it holds it nice and tight and firm, and it releases it cleanly and smoothly. So that's a job in itself, just to slice that down and put that little bit of horn in there. The feathers is what a fletcher would use. Now these are black feathers, a lot of them would have been white, there would be goose feathers. So the two massive powers in the medieval world was the church and the crown. So this is the king and this is the pope, or whoever was sort of the leader of your religious sort of segment at the time. And what was kind of commonly done was that the church would have one wing of a goose and they would produce quills and they would use them for scribing and writing. And the crown would have the other wing and they would use those feathers for turning into arrows. Now the reason you don't want to mix these around is because the arrow rifles in flight. Now what that means is it spins as it goes. Now if you start spinning something in the air, it gains accuracy and it gains range, so it makes it a lot easier to hit your target, and you can hit your target at a greater distance. But because birds have developed over millions of years to be incredibly good at flying, their feathers are so specialist that if you put two feathers from the left wing of a bird and the third feather from the right wing of the bird, two of those feathers are going to try and make the arrow go in one direction, so clockwise. One of those feathers is going to try and make it go the other way around, anti-clockwise. And you don't want that. That's going to spoil the dynamics, the aerodynamics of your arrow. So if you ensure that all of your feathers come from only one wing, all those feathers are going to work in the same fashion. They're all going to rotate in the same direction, which is why the king took one wing and the church took the other wing. So they knew that all the feathers they were using were going to work successfully to create an excellent arrow as it goes through the air. The fletchings as well, these sort of little strings on here that hold it together, they would use animal glue, so rendered down fats, rendered down bone as a glue. They would mix in something called verdigris. So this is something that happens to copper. It becomes a sort of a poisonous oxide of copper, and they would mix that in with the glue so that when you put all these arrows into barrels, hundreds of thousands of them, ship them over to France to your army, mites don't eat all of your feathers, because as soon as they get close to it, the verdigris poisons them. So there's a huge amount of technology and thought that goes into developing these arrows. The shaft itself often would be used ash. So ash is very, very good at absorbing impacts. It's used in hammer handles, in tool handles. It can flex without shattering. the compression that it gets, it can absorb without breaking. So as you release this arrow, you're pushing an enormous amount of power into it. Now if you don't use the right kind of wood, that arrow will literally shatter as it leaves your bow. Once it does leave the bow, if it leaves successfully, when it hits something, you want it to push forward with its entire weight into your target. Now if the first thing that happens when it hits your target is that arrow snaps in half, some of the momentum, some of the force is going to be lost because it's not going to be delivered into your target. So if you select the right kind of wood, ash wood, it's going to be able to absorb that flex that we'll talk about a little later around the archer's paradox, and when it hits the target, it's not going to break the arrow, it's going to deliver all of that force with the whole weight of the arrow. The tip is often made out of iron, so they could have been steel, but steel is a little bit more expensive to produce, and iron does the job just as well. It's reasonably hard, it might deform against a hard target, so you do see some steel tips as well, but iron is a lot easier, a lot cheaper to produce. Now this head on here is something called a bodkin, but there's various different kinds of heads, and I'm just going to show you a few of those that we use both in the military aspect and around in the hunting aspect. So we've got a few different heads down here. So these ones are ones that you might see on the battlefield. So we've got something called a bodkin, which looks a little bit like a pyramid in shape. It's got quite a large heavy weight on that tip. Now the idea of this shape is it's going to be used against armoured opponents. So if they've got mail, these little rings interlocking, hopefully this pyramid is going to just get inside one of them and pop that ring open. And as it does that, the rest of the arrow can pass through. It's equally good against plate. If you can hit flush, that means dead flat onto the plate of an enemy, it might be able to dent it, it might be able to compromise it, it might even be able to punch a hole in it in rare occasions. So the bodkin is what the most common battlefield head that we find in archaeological. This is a needle nose bodkin, so very similar design, but it's been extended, so you've got a little bit more weight and a lot longer point on it. So very similar sort of style, but just a variation on a theme. This one, a broadhead. So we think that these were commonly used against large targets. Now, if you shoot a horse with something like a bodkin, it's probably going to do an awful lot of damage to the horse. But a horse is a very, very big animal. It's got huge muscles, and you're not going to necessarily take it down very quickly with one of these little small-headed arrow tips. If you use a broadhead, it's going to do a lot more soft tissue damage. It's not the most pleasant thing to think about, but then warfare never really is. But a big broad head like this is going to be able to sever more muscles. It's going to have a greater chance of severing vital things like arteries, tendons, all sorts of things like that, and it's going to hopefully bring the horse down a lot quicker. Now the problem is, you can see it's quite thin, so if that goes up against an armoured opponent, it might bend or deform the arrowhead. So that's why it's thought that this is probably used against horses tending to have less armour on them. They might have chaffrons, they might have some barding that's going to protect them, but it's not going to have as much protection on the horse as a man in mail or in armour is going to have. The last one we'll talk about, this funny shaped one with a little sort of cage head, we believe is used in warfare. So this is called a fire arrow. So the idea of this is you stuff that little space with some old rope, maybe some cloth, you soak it in some pitch, some tar or some oil, and then you light it. Now we talked about the aerodynamics of an arrow, the way it spins through flight. If you suddenly put a huge weight on here and lots of it sticking out in all sorts of angles, you're going to ruin the aerodynamics of it. So this is why we think it's used in a siege. You're not necessarily targeting an individual. What you're trying to do is get it over a wall and hopefully stick it in something flammable. Maybe the thatch of a building, maybe some wooden structures, something along those lines. So you don't necessarily need the accuracy and the range that that rifling spinning effect gets when you can stand close enough to a castle wall and just lob it over the wall. It does reduce the accuracy, it does reduce the range, but it still does the job. Now in Hollywood, they see these people using these fire arrows and shooting them at individuals. It's a bit of a Hollywood myth. Funnily enough, if you're stabbed with an arrow, you're probably going to experience as bad a day as whether you're stabbed with an arrow and then on fire. So it's the stabbing with the arrow bit that we really want to achieve when you're shooting an individual. It's the setting on fire bit that we want to achieve when you're shooting into buildings and structures. So those are some of the military ones. We've got another few heads here, so these are some of the ones that we think are going to be used in hunting. So we'll go with this one. So this is a Type 34, and it's a swallowtail arrowhead. So the idea of this is when you're going hunting, if you're hunting something particularly large, a boar or a deer, something like that, it's very, very hard to kill it with a single shot. You have to be a very skilled archer. And even then, they are big animals. They're going to take a long time to die. So the problem is, if you shoot them with a bow and the arrow hits them and then the animal bolts away, the arrow can slide out, the animal can run away. The idea of these prongs is once that arrow goes in, those barbs on the back of it snag inside the animal. So the more that arrow is brushed against the tree and bushes as the animal runs away, the more damage it's going to do. Okay, so it's going to cause a large amount of bleeding, it's going to do a lot of muscle damage, and that animal is going to weaken and weaken, and you can hopefully follow the trail as the broken leaves and the broken branches, or even maybe a blood trail, and you can find that animal when it's exhausted and it's come to ground. So the arrow helps you hunting by doing more damage to the animal once it's inside it. This one, the crescent shape, we believe is used against small fowl. So this is pheasant, partridge, quail, things like that. If you use a pointed tip arrow, then the chances are that as that arrow goes into the small body of the bird, it's either going to pass through it and destroy the animal, because if you send an entire length of arrow through an animal, it's going to ruin all of the meat inside it. So instead what we do is have this big wide head. So the idea of that is it spreads the force, and instead of the entire arrow going in or through the animal, you just get the tip of it going in. It lodges inside the animal. It does a huge amount of soft tissue damage by having this great big broad head, and if you're very lucky, the animal falls from the sky or falls from the tree it's perched on, and you end up with the arrow marking the spot where it is, just lodging inside the breast of the bird. And you can find it and you can recover and you can get the meat in a much more acceptable state than if you sent an entire 36-inch arrow through the body of the animal. The last one we're going to talk about, this blunt-headed arrowhead. So this isn't necessarily used for hunting for meat. People used to hunt all sorts of different reasons. One of the reasons they would hunt for is for pelt. That means the fur of the animal. So if you're trying to hunt down a rabbit, or weasels or stoats, to try and skin them and use that fur to line your clothing or anything else like that, you don't want to put a hole in that fur, because that's going to affect where you can cut it and what kind of things you can use it for. So if you use something like this, a blunt-headed arrow, you can hit the animal, because it's small, with enough force that it'll stun the animal. You can then hopefully send out your dogs who are specially trained not to puncture the skin again, they just collect it in their muzzle, or you can go out yourself and collect that stunned animal. You can dispatch it, you can kill the animal, and then you recover the skin without any holes in it. So it's another way of hunting, whether it be for meat, whether it be using on the battlefield, another variation on a different kind of arrow. So that's some of the arrows as well. We'll go into how we now combine the bow and the arrow on the battlefield, and some of the different things that people were doing in the medieval period to make the best use of both of them.